avian migration. And what that really means is that we're trying to figure out a little bit about how migration works, where do birds go, and a little bit about the science of it. And then we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do to see what's going on in migration. Okay, so like this slide that's up there right now, the title slide, was taken last week in Nebraska. One of the coolest migrations that goes on in North America is the migration of the sandhill cranes and a few other species like the whooping cranes and things like that come along with them. And that goes right up through the Central Flyway, and it's restricted to about 150, 200-mile stretch across Nebraska. And all of the birds funnel up from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Gulf of California, and they come right up through the center plate, through Nebraska, and then they fan out back up into the far north, as far north as Alaska, and close to the Arctic in Canada. It's just a phenomenal thing to see this many birds. So all of the birds in here are likely going to be sandhills. There might be a whooping crane in there. I can't tell. It's a little too small to ID the birds. So it's just a fun slide just to get us started about what migration kind of looks like. So that's where we are. All right. So I got to talk a little bit about Denver Audubon because that's who I am. Denver Audubon's been around for 54 years. It's a great organization. You see our mission statement here. What we're really trying to do is to conserve birds and the habitat that they live in and other wildlife that comes along with them. Okay. We are a separate chapter from a lot of the things that you might have also heard about in Colorado. The National Audubon is a totally separate organization from us. It's a separate 501c3 company. It has its own set of donors. Denver Audubon has its own set of donors. So if you are a member of Denver Audubon, chances are you get communications from National too. And then there's another group that's called Audubon of the Rockies. And that's really kind of the science and policy segment of the Denver and the Rocky Mountain region, or of Audubon in the Rocky Mountain region. So it's a little different. Again, it's a separate organization. We all try to work hand in hand on certain projects. So it's all good. We have a lot of programs at Denver Audubon, local birding, field trips, classes, workshops. I do teach a beginning birding class that it's starting in a couple of weeks. I don't know that there's any openings left in it or not, but you could call the office or send an email and find out. We do a lot of other adult trainings. Like I said, I'm a graduate of the Audubon Master Birder program. That's a year-long intensive, a great program if you're really interested in birds. And then we do a lot of research and outreach. We're supported by over 150 volunteers, and we have a lot of fun. And then we're also supported financially by over 1,000 supporters locally. So migration. Where would you go if you were at a bird right now and you were migrating? Now, bear in mind, this is spring migration, so the birds are going north. So you can't say Cancun, but I'm not sure you'd want to be in Cancun in the winter. So it's really kind of one of those things about where would you go? Why would you migrate? The whole thing about migration is based on really two things. It's based on where they can find food and where they can find where the birds can find food and where they can find nesting locations. Okay, where can they raise their young? Where can they support a family and potentially more than one? Okay, like the bluebird that's in the lower right there, eating a nice little bug, right? That's a wonderful bluebird. It's a local bird. We have them that nest here. We have a lot of bluebird routes on the open spaces throughout Douglas County. And so it's something that we can see and something that we can be up close and personal with. But they have, 2 and sometimes 3 broods a year. So they're looking for something that is going to give them a long-term opportunity for nesting. They have to have consistent food over that time. They have to have food not only for the adults, but food for the kids. So the chicks have to have potentially part of that same diet, sometimes a little different. Sometimes they need a little softer food. They may not feed a cricket to a very young bird, or they might, look more for a mealworm or something like that, or a caterpillar that they can break apart more easily for the youngsters. So it's those kinds of considerations that really make it hard, or, that the birds have to go to some stretch to find a good place to support their young. Okay. Birds eat almost everything. I mentioned the little cricket that the bluebird has there. They're insectivores. They eat almost purely insects. So if they migrate too early and we have a great big freeze and the insects die off, they're in trouble. Okay. If they've started a brood and they need that much food, they're in trouble. So it's a tightrope that the bluebirds walk on in terms of when do they start nesting? Are the insects and things like that they need there for them to start their brood? And so it's something that they have to consider, and they instinctively know how to approach that. The western grebes on the top are, eat fish. They can't migrate until the lakes are open. They've got to be able to get underwater, go fishing in order to feed themselves and eventually their young. The little nuthatch down in the lower left, it's a red-breasted nuthatch. They love to eat seeds, okay? And that's almost their entire diet. They will eat some insects, but their primary thing is going to be seeds. So it's going to be something, when are the seeds going to be available for them? Sometimes they can eat some of last year's, sometimes they have to wait for this year's. So it's something that they have to consider about when and where they migrate. Birds don't migrate always to consistent places, but sometimes they do. So the cranes that you see today in Monte Vista probably aren't the same cranes that you're going to see up around Steamboat. The nuthatches that are in your backyard may stay there year round, or it might be some other ones that are migrating in from further away. Okay, but it's not just about food, it's the type of food, like I started to allude to already. So a couple years ago, I was on the South Platte with my camera, and I was doing a research for an upcoming bird walk for one of my classes. And I saw these beautiful wood ducks, and they looked like they were looking down right in front of them in the water, and they were fishing, or they were looking for food in the same place that I would toss a fly, if I was fishing for trout. I don't think they're fishing for trout. That would be a little bit big for them. But I thought, what are they doing? It looked like they were eating something off the surface, which is that right-hand photo. They would just dip their bill right to the surface of the water and come back up. Well, this is normal behavior for many of our dabbling ducks. And it's something that I learned, and I watched and learned by observing it, and then went out and did the research and said, yes, this is normal behavior. A lot of times, ducks like the wood ducks or gadwalls will delay their laying their brood, their eggs, until after the insects appear on the water to where they can get enough protein in their diet to support egg production. So not only is the place important, but the type of food is important. And that's where they're going to end their migration. If they can't get the food, it's quite likely they'll pick up stakes and go fly someplace else in search for that food. So it's an interesting thing that birds do in migration that people don't think about. People just think, oh, they're going to, the robins are going to come in, and why aren't we seeing very many robins this year? Well, it's dry. There's no food for them. Okay, so it's those kinds of considerations that we have to think about. So there's basically 4 different types of migration. Permanent residence, it's not really a migration. Okay, they don't really migrate. They're going to find food around where they spent their summer. So I've got a little black-capped chickadee here, and we have black-capped chickadees here at my house in the winter. And down in the summer, they're down at the front of the property, down in the riparian area, or over by the golf course. And so it's something that they're not really migrating, but they're moving around to where they've got the food. Now, birds like chickadees, or the nuthatches, the little red-breasted nuthatch that we saw, the white-breasted, the pygmies, they're going to cache food. So when the food is abundant in the summertime, they're going to cache it in cracks in the bark and underneath the limb in an open area. They're going to cache it in an old cavity. They're going to do whatever they can to make sure that they've got food for the winter. So these little birds have to remember all of the morsels that they stuck around the yard. And so it might be that they've put in thousands of these little morsels to support them over the winter, and they have to know where to put them or they starve. They're unbelievably intelligent in terms of understanding where they've put something to support themselves. The research into the cognition of birds is absolutely astounding. Great topic for another presentation sometime. It's really kind of fun. A short distance migrant like the robin I've got here, they are only going to move like a short distance. They might move from like a robin might move from Evergreen or a little higher than that down into Denver area. They might move from Denver down into Colorado Springs or out into the plains a little bit. Again, just looking where they can find food. Robins in the summer are insectivores. They eat almost exclusively insects. But in the fall and the winter, they switch and they eat berries. So anything from juniper berries to choke cherries, almost any kind of berry that's left on, like a currant plant or something like that that's dried up. They love them during the winter. They don't cache. They're moving to try to find food. Okay. The medium distance migrants cover distances that might span 1 to several states. Okay, so our bluebirds actually fit into this category. The bluebirds that we have here migrate down to northern New Mexico, Texas type areas. But some of the mountain and western bluebirds that end up in Texas and New Mexico also nest all the way up into Wyoming and Montana. So it's going to be a little bit different. They're going to cover a little bit more territory than what our birds might, but they're still considered medium distance migrants. I'm showing a killdeer here. We sometimes have killdeer that'll winter here, but not very often. They'll usually fly away, particularly for the really inclement weather, go find someplace a little bit warmer. They're insectivores. They can eat other things too, grains and things like that too. The long distance migrant, and I'm showing a spotted sandpiper here, may go from one end of the country in the United States to the other. They might migrate from Alaska down to New Mexico or Texas, or they might go from Alaska all the way down to Argentina. And we'll talk about a couple of real champions when it comes to migration in a little bit. There's a lot of mysteries that we don't know about migration. There's things that, confuse us. One year the birds leave on, to go north on the 15th of March. The next year they wait and migrate on the 15th of April. Why? Well, what's the weather like? What's the winds like? Okay, those are things that the birds are paying attention to. Maybe they're looking at day length for some perspective. Maybe they're looking at lower temperatures or higher temperatures, depending upon which migration you're talking about. Maybe they're looking at changes in food supply. Okay, there's a lot of things that the birds are just born to do from a genetic perspective. And some of the first year birds, like a white-crowned sparrow that's born in Alaska, knows that it has to get to Bosque del Apache in New Mexico, and mom and dad have already left, and they fly by themselves all the way down to New Mexico, and they've never been there before. And then in the spring, they fly back to Alaska, where they're going to breed. So it's things, birds can cover thousands of miles, and they do it genetically, they do it by instinct, they do it by just mom and dad talking to them, perhaps. There's a lot of things, like I said, that we don't know. There's mechanisms that are really cool that the birds are using that we're working to try to understand. The world's diagram here is going to be important for us to think about. We are in what is called the Central Flyway here in Denver, and that covers everything from like Mississippi, Arkansas, on the east, all the way to the Rocky Mountains on the west. Okay, and there's some overlap with other flyways in terms of the Pacific Flyway, the Western Flyway, and the Eastern Flyway. And then we talk about this one over here, that is the Far Eastern or Mid-Atlantic, or excuse me, Western Atlantic flyway that goes up from Argentina all the way up into Newfoundland. Okay, but notice that up here on the top, the flyways kind of come apart. It hits the top of the land in northern Canada and Alaska, and it kind of flattens out and goes across, because those birds up there, the shorebirds and things like that migrate from that high altitude or high latitude, are really looking for that habitat, and that habitat exists all across that open water of the next to the Arctic Ocean. So it's kind of a mixed bag. So when we think about the birds here in Colorado, we're looking at birds that are going to pass through here. Some of our migrants come from further south. I mentioned a couple of them a little earlier, and we'll get into them a little deeper. But I want to talk about, what happens when something goes wrong. Okay. This is a bird that we saw last week in Nebraska. It's called a common crane. Common cranes are anything but common here in the United States. They're seen every 2, 3 years, 4 years. The last time one was seen in this area was 4 years ago. And it was, strangely enough, it was seen like at less than a half a mile from where we had this sighting. Is it the same bird? No clue. Why is it here? You see the map in the lower left that talks about where this bird normally is in the summer. That's that kind of orangey color. And it runs all the way across from northern Europe, all the way across Russia, up into the northern latitudes of eastern Russia. Remember the overlaps of the central flyway reach over into Asia here. Okay, that's the kind of thing that's happening here. Now, we don't know whether this bird is just hanging out with the sandhills and just said, okay, I'm going to go with you guys. I don't know, maybe he's Charlie Brown for the common cranes, whatever. Maybe he was abandoned as a young, or his mother, his common crane mother, laid an egg in a nest that was a sandhill crane's nest. So he thinks he's a sandhill crane. We did this intentionally, or the scientists did this intentionally back in the 80s, in that they were trying to support the whooping crane population. So they put a bunch of whooping crane eggs in sandhill crane nests. And they raised, the sandhills raised these larger birds, the larger cranes, the whoopers, but they imprinted that, like the whooping cranes were sandhills. So they never really bred by themselves, but they behaved like sandhills, and they migrated with the sandhills. And maybe that's what's going on with this bird. Bottom line, we don't know, but it happens on occasion. So we're always looking for these vagrant migrants, then trying to figure out why they're here. Okay. There's a lot that we don't know, and a few things that we do know about how birds migrate, what causes them to migrate, how do they navigate? Okay. There's a lot of things, a lot of birds migrate at night. It's cooler, the air is a little denser, they can fly higher, they can fly farther. And since it's cooler, they're not burning as much energy. So they like to think about flying, a lot of them at night. And so that's the reason, when we talk about birdcast a little bit later, why we're so interested in keeping a dark sky, because the lights confuse the birds flying over. So they're using a lot of senses to navigate. They're looking at the sun, the position of the rising sun. They're looking at the position of the moon. They're looking at the position of the stars, potentially. Do they understand what the North Star is? There's postulates that say yes. We don't know how to ask them to really confirm that, but there are postulates that say that they understand how to read at least some concept that says north and south. They also have, there's evidence that they are sensing the Earth's magnetic field. There seems to be some nerve endings and some ways in the bills of some birds that look like they can sense the magnetic field. How they use that, we don't know. But we know that we can confuse a bird by changing that magnetic field in some studies. They also get information from landmarks, particularly the waterfowl and the cranes and some other birds like that. When they migrate, they tend to follow that same physical route, and they say, I'm going to pass on the Front Range, I'm going to pass right over the top of I-25. They're not probably following I-25, but they're looking and keeping the foothills, to their west, and they're just flying along the Front Range. When they get up into Wyoming, it opens up. There's individual mountains that they fly by, and so it gives them that guidance that they need to go there. There's even some evidence that smell may change it. Okay, so like when we had the forest fires up in Montana and Wyoming a couple of years ago, the birds still migrated when they came south that fall. But they went around that because the birds that were caught in that smoke were confused. Was it because of lack of visibility? Well, I don't think so, because they were flying over it. Was it the smell? Maybe. So there's a lot of things that we're looking at and saying, there's a lot of evidence. We still don't understand everything that provides the answers. Okay, so where do my migrating birds go? Okay, the Swainson's hawk goes, it winters anywhere from northern Mexico, it summers in northern Mexico, all the way up through Colorado, all the way up into Alaska. It's one of our summertime hawks. We don't see them in the winter. They haven't arrived yet this spring. They usually come in April and pass through. Then they migrate down through Mexico, straight across Panama, go all the way down over the Amazon, and end up in central Argentina. And then in the spring, they come back again. Okay, really kind of cool migration pattern. Along the way, these great big birds, these are Swainson's hawk is about the same size as a red tail. And so they're eating almost exclusively grasshoppers in their migration. So that's kind of an interesting migration path, very long distance. The white-crowned sparrow, it's a little bit of everything. We see that it migrates from Alaska. When I go to visit my son in Alaska, we see white-crowned sparrows in his backyard. We've seen them all the way up into the Alaskan range, just east of Denali. We've seen them everywhere in Alaska. They're great birds. They're wonderful little things. But then they migrate down south, and there's a permanent resident group that is in the mountains of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and a little bit over into Nevada and California. It's actually a different subspecies, and so it has a different migration pattern. It shows that it's year-round in those mountain communities, but a lot of times those birds will just slip down into the foothills. And so we'll see them at like the banding station at Chatfield, both in the spring and the fall. And then there's the spotted towhee. The map for the spotted towhee is just kind of disjoint and it's crazy. But really what happens, it's a medium distance migrant. But what seems to happen is that it's what I call a replacement migrant. So the birds up into Canada are, they're looking for areas where they can find food in the winter. So they fly down into Wyoming and Colorado for the winter. And it's not showing very much of a winter population here in Colorado on this particular map, but we do have them. I have them in my backyard in the winter. And then we see them going all the way down into Texas and Mexico and, for the winter. So it's kind of a little bit of a mixed bag for this. Are there specific subspecies of this bird that we don't know about yet? That's the things that are going on in terms of research. So the northern birds come down to Colorado winter, then they go back to the north. The birds down in Texas come up into Colorado and spend the summer. So that's where we get that kind of replacement migration concept that happens with some birds. Some birds use different routes for fall and spring migration. A great example is the rufous hummingbirds. We know them because they come to our feeders in August, late July and August, and they're the bullies. They're the ones who chase away all the other birds that are going to maintain their territory. They're feisty little birds. They're beautiful. Their spring migration comes from central Mexico up the West Coast into Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, even into Southeast Alaska, where they breed. In the fall, they come back down through the Rocky Mountains. So when we think about this bird, it's a hummingbird. It relies on two things for food: insects, particularly small insects, and nectar. Okay. The West Coast has wonderful support of early spring flowers. They have an earlier spring than what we have up here in Colorado, that's for sure. So that gives them that nectar, and it gives them the small insects. Now, this year, they might have a little problem with all the rain and all of the crazy storms that are going on in California. Well, it'll be interesting to see how our population changes come fall when they start coming down through Colorado. But like the spring migration going up through California, the Rocky Mountains are filled with blossoms and insects and things like that during the fall. It's a wonderful smorgasbord for these little birds. They're they're wonderful to encounter in the mountains. They're great things. So there's many ongoing studies that are into migration. It's one of the hottest topics in all of ornithology. So there's lots of things looking at DNA. There's lots of things looking at putting backpacks on the birds. So this little painted bunting up here on his lower back, right above the tail, there's this really small little backpack that's attached with a couple stitches into his skin, and he carries that around for several years usually. And so what that does is every time it passes a MODIS station, which is a receiver site that says, hey, I see this transmitter coming into my area, send me your data. And then it tells that station where it's been over the past, year or whatever. And then it goes on about its time and hits another station, downloads some more data. This gives us really good information about where specific species of birds are going. It's a really fascinating thing about what's going on. Okay, the bird banding station and recaptures give us a great shot at DNA, gives us a great shot at where birds are going. It gives us a good idea about some of the behavior of some specific particular birds, and we'll cover a little bit of that in the next slide. There's also studies of wind aloft that are, what winds are favorable to migration. This is part of that dark sky initiative where they say there's going to be 1.7 million birds that are going to fly over Colorado tonight. Okay, where are they getting that data? How do they know they're going to be moving tonight and not tomorrow? And they're looking at the favorability of the winds. They're looking at where the birds are staged from tracking them day over day. And that's where the integration of the weather radar, which is the bottom point, comes down here, which is National Audubon's Birdcast project. They can look and they can see, here's a mass of birds that are going north. We can see something about their size. We can conjecture their species. So it gives you an idea of what birds are flying over, even though we can't physically see them. So banding, as I said, shows us some migration habits. Okay, so here's this little yellow warbler. It's a male, and one just like this was captured 28 times at the Chatfield banding station over a 10-year period. Okay, one thing I can say about this bird, he doesn't learn very much, but The same net, it was in the same net series at Chatfield Station down right along the South Platte River. Probably within, his nest was within 5 feet of where it had been every one of those 10 years. This level of nest site fidelity is common in many bird species, but we didn't know about it for this particular species. This was fascinating. The other thing that was fascinating is here's this little 5-inch long bird that survived 10 years in the wild and had successful nests all of those 10 years. So we can also see a lot of migration paths and timing. So the timing, this is one of the representations that we use at the Chatfield banding station. And what this shows is, when do we capture each one of these species of birds? So if we look on here and find our little yellow warbler, it starts showing up right at the end of April. And then we capture them completely, for the entire time through May 16th when the banding station is closed. It's not one of the early arrivals like the Wilson's warbler or the yellow-rumped warbler. It's something that arrives a little bit later. Now, some of the flycatchers don't arrive until mid-May or early May. And then some of the orioles and cedar waxwings arrive in later May. Having the bird in hand, we've actually also done a lot of DNA research. We've taken I'd say a drop of blood, but it's really not. It's a fraction of a drop of blood that, from each one of these, from each one of the birds that we capture for specific species, like the yellow warblers is one that we're studying that way right now. There's another research project where they were studying the DNA of Wilson's warblers. So that's where this came from. So what that DNA research told us is, oh, look, there's several different subspecies of Wilson's warblers. There's an eastern variety. There's a northwestern variety. There's a California variety, a couple of them. And then there's a mountain region variety, and they don't mix. They come back to the same places every year. They don't really interbreed. So it gives us some great ideas about, what is the subspecies going on? What's different about these subspecies, where some like the far north, some like the mountain region, and some like the balmy weather in California. So what's caused the speciation and these subspecies? Then we get to see how many are there in individual counts in migration, and how many of different kinds are in the different nesting areas for these overall Wilson's warbler species in Mexico. So it's a very interesting process, very time consuming, but it gives us a good understanding. Now we get to go to the next layer of research and find out why. Another backpack study that is really fascinating to me is the Rough-Legged Hawk Project. They have a little bit bigger backpack than what we saw on the painted bunting earlier. And so this rough-legged hawk, we have them here in Colorado in the winter. And they're beautiful birds. They're one of our winter hawks here in Colorado. You can see that the southern terminus about where they fly is, there's one down in New Mexico, Arizona, a couple down in Southern California, but most of them are right about, Wyoming, going across into Utah, Northern California, and then all the way up. And then there's this one over here in Michigan. I'm not quite sure what he's about. So it tells us a lot about the variance of that particular species. So this hawk flies, it's got enough power that it actually uses a satellite receiver or transmitter, and it relays its data up every time it's stationary for a period of time. Then it says, here I am, and that's all it tells. That's all it tells the satellite is, here's my current latitude and longitude and a time. Okay, but here's one of the hawks that really interested me. And remember that site fidelity for nesting? Well, this bird expresses a site fidelity for where it winters. So it winters here in northeastern Colorado, and then look at how far it goes. And this is over 3 years of 3 tracks that it went across all of these different areas. Great view about where this bird is gone. Now, we don't know why. What changed in the food? What changed in, was he a young bird when he was first caught and he was exploring the world? And now he's a little bit older and he's decided he really likes that kind of Hudson Bay, Northwest Passage area to summer in? We don't know. Those are things that are still questions that we have to answer. But that consistency of the wintering grounds for this particular species of bird is really fascinating. The birds that we're seeing here every winter, chances are the same birds that we see every winter. They're going to be near this winter site that they have chosen. Birds fly a long ways for some things. The current record is a bar-tailed godwit. It nests in Alaska, and it flew almost 8,500 miles to get to the Tasmania coast in Australia. And that's where it winters. Okay, most of the time they stop in New Zealand. It's not something that we see a lot here in the continental United States. You have to go to Alaska really to see these birds. Occasionally we'll see some over on the northwest coast. But they're really cool birds. And to think about, even when they go to New Zealand, that's just a mere 7,000 miles. But they're doing all of this flight nonstop. This is 9 to 11 days of flapping your wings and flying. And most of it is over open ocean. How are they navigating? So it's a very interesting thing to think about. How does this bird get from Alaska to Australia and New Zealand without a GPS? Okay. This is kind of one of those mysteries that we're still working on, and we haven't figured out how to quite ask him. Now, this particular bird has that same backpack that we saw on the rough-legged hawk. You see the antenna coming down, and it's constantly giving a GPS location about where it's going or where it is. So cool stuff. This is a Winslow Loft picture, and it's available to anyone. This is a public site, this earth.nullschool.net. It does not require a sign up. It's just a really neat site for meteorological geeks. This little circle here, this is about us here in Denver and Douglas County. Okay, and it's approximate because they don't really have a good map underneath this. They expect everybody to be able to see from rivers and water features and things. So this is the Arkansas River, and this is the South Platte River. So we're kind of between them. Okay. What this is showing is the Winslow Loft. This particular example is about 10,000 feet. A lot of birds are going to be flying from 10 to 15,000 feet in elevation. Okay, some go higher, particularly the cranes. When they cross over into Alaska, they might be at more like about a 20,000 foot elevation. And this data is for, sorry about that. This data is for September 3rd, 2020. So the birds are going south in this one. It's fall migration. So the birds are coming south, and they're going to be following this really nice wind. It's going to break them, rock stars in terms of following, in terms of the amount of distance they're going to go in a given day. And then they're going to hit this front, and the wind is going to go push it back to the northwest. They don't want to go to the northwest. So all of these birds that are in this stream coming down from the north are all going to cut down to the ground right here along that interface. Birders' delight. We get to go see where the winds are going to be predicted to where we can see the most birds on migration. It's cool. But it also helps us understand what birds are going to be overflying us. If we're here in Denver, then this area here is going to be not devoid of birds, but it's not going to be a really heavy migration day for us. So we're not going to see a whole lot in here of migrating birds. But also the birds that are with us now, there's no favorable winds for them to get up and join to go further south. So they're going to stay with us a little bit longer. How do the birds know what the winds are aloft? Okay, we're not quite sure how they tell the weather and how they can figure that out, but they do seem to do a very good job of doing that. This is birdcast. And so this tells us, this is what we use to say there's going to be 30,000 or 30 million birds overfly Denver tonight. Okay, so we're here in Denver, and you see the dark, the lighter color. This is going to be a very high overcast day for us, or bird day for us here. So we can tell a lot from this. This is using weather data, and that's the green dots are all the weather radar systems. The weather radar can be tuned separately from looking at clouds to look at masses of birds. So it gives us a way to understand what birds are moving and how. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of a dive into one bird today and talk about where we might see this bird. This bird is highly migratory. You see where it winters down in South America along the coastlines, into the Gulf Islands, and then it also migrates, or it also winters down along Texas coast, southern coast, all the way up into Virginia and Maryland, and then all the way up the coast in California. It summers in these areas here, this blue area, or this kind of brownish area, and this is where it summers. It's where it breeds. Okay, this little willet, I saw a willet on the April 24th in Chatfield State Park. Chatfield State Park's here. This map's wrong. How can I tell that I could really have a chance to see this? So these instructions here, and I will make a PDF version of this available to you, so you can walk through these. So I'm going to change to a different application here. And you should be able to see eBird. Can you see eBird now? I hope so. I think that's correct. And so
yes, we can see it.
Okay. So I've gone through the instructions that are behind this eBird screen now. And I've gone down into, I've entered that it's a willet, and you see that up here. And I'm looking at willets. And this is all of the places that willets can be found on the 4th of January. Okay. So let's take a look, and I want to take a look at Colorado. So I'm just going to spin this down here to where I'm roughly centered in Colorado. And I'm going to go in a little bit to where I can see where Colorado is. There's Colorado. So I'm going to spin it into the center. And I'm going to say, now, let's look and see where we start to see willets in Colorado. Nothing in January. Nothing in February. Nothing in March. In April, down in the southwest side, this is the Arkansas River Valley, the Monte Vista Wildlife Area, and for some reason, right around like Dillon Lake or something like that. So we're starting to see some willets show up. They're just transients, most likely. They're looking and saying, where do I want to go? This is a stopover. Like these are all, where it's stopping are going to be wildlife sanctuaries. There's going to be food there. There's going to be other birds there. There's going to be safety there. So we can go on further here, and we can start to see the yellowish, and then you see the purple over here. This is where it's really intense. There's really a lot of birds. A willet's not a common bird in Colorado, in case you haven't noticed. We don't see a lot of them, but the red means that we're starting to see a greater concentration. So we start to see go a little further in May. Now we're starting to see, a little bit, still the same areas, but we're still seeing some transients. Okay, and still in May. Now we start getting into the end of May and we start hitting the breeding season. Okay, now the primary place that we see them is North Park. And this is one of the few places in Colorado that this bird actually nests. It's in North Park. So you'll see them up there. There's a couple of wildlife areas around Walden, if you're familiar with that part of the state. And there's some really great things, great places to go up there to bird. And this is one of the few places in the state that you'll commonly find willets. But this is getting close to April when I saw my bird. So there's still some birds that are here in the Denver area, not very many, but a few. So this is kind of when I saw my birds, is in that April, or is in that April timeframe. And I'm actually well past that. Sorry, I got confused. Okay, now we start getting into later in the year, into June. Most of these birds have bred, they've had their young. The young are getting big enough to start to fly. What we're starting to see is that some of the birds down in here are starting to return south already. Sometimes the willets will have a second brood, sometimes they won't. Okay, so now we start to see a little bit more pickup into July. We start to see a little bit more dispersal of the birds starting to come back through Colorado on their way south. Into September, we start to see a little kick up over on the eastern plains, but we don't see them up here in Walden anymore. They've already moved off to the nest. So it's just a great way to think about where you can find birds at what time of year during migration. So this is kind of a summary of that. So with that, I just wanted to close with this. What would happen if birds could read? So my cartoon here is a cardinal, which is a beautiful bird. I've only seen them a few times in my life because it's not a common bird here in Colorado. I've heard of one over in Parker a couple of years ago, but that's about it. This particular bird decided that he didn't want to be a common bird wherever he is in Ohio or Kentucky or wherever he's flying from. He wanted to be something unique, so he flew to Oregon and made his home there. So if birds could read, we'd be in a lot of trouble, particularly if they have an ego like this guy. So are there any questions? I don't see anything in the Q&A section at this point. Amy, so do you have anything?
Hi, I don't have anything in the Q&A and chat. Let's just give it just a couple minutes. Thank you. I thought that was really fascinating with the two different types of cranes that you saw, the sandhill and then the common. And just trying to puzzle out how that guy is hanging out with them. How, why, when can we expect hummingbirds?
So broadtails are going to be the first to arrive, and the black-chinned. And so they usually start showing up in late April into early May. And they'll start nesting in mid-May.
Great. Anybody else? It is fun. We do have, if you've never followed, we have a Wildlife Wednesday feature on Douglas Land Conservancy's Facebook page. And while it's just a fun way to share photos and admire people's great photography of wildlife on social media, it does act as a little bit of a citizen science project for DLC. We can kind of track when the hummingbirds are coming back. We can see when bears come out of hibernation and so on. So if you haven't followed that on Douglas Land Conservancy's Facebook page, go ahead and give it a follow. It's really fun.
Okay.
Let's see a couple more questions.
So have the bluebirds been coming early this year? No, this is about right for them. The bluebird routes, Elizabeth and I have been managing bluebird routes for about the past 10 to 12 years. And we started out at Cherokee Ranch and are now managing most of the routes here in Douglas County. And so this is about the right time for them to start showing up. They'll start nesting usually in late April or early May. And that's when they can get in trouble, is the first 2 weeks of May. Yes. Do I work with the folks at Chatfield as well to document migration? Yes, I do. I do work at the banding station in Chatfield. The same group of people manages the banding station at Bar Lake in the fall. Great group of folks, wonderful birders, conscientious. It's wonderful to work around them. Bohemian waxwings, yes, I still see some of them or hear of some of them. I have not seen them lately myself, but they seem to be moving up a little bit in altitude. I'm not sure what that's about.
Do you want to share with the group a little bit about that this year and how interesting it was?
Okay, so Bohemians are not something that are common to Colorado at all. Okay, so this year, the food resources in central Canada were indicative that the birds were going to be able to winter there. And so the Bohemian waxwings and some other birds that we find here every now and then live almost year round in central Canada, but they have to have a food resource to do that. So they had kind of a dry year in central Canada, and so we knew that the birds were going to come south. We didn't know exactly when, and we didn't know how many of them. And so on New Year's Day, I saw a flock of like 200 of them just west of Castle Rock. Great photo op. A few weeks later in February, I was able to go out to Cherry Creek Reservoir, and I saw another group of about 200 there and got some good photos. So they're still around to some degree. They should be starting to head back north and thinking about nesting up there. They are a fairly early nester, so they'll probably be up there probably no later than the end of May. The one that traveled 8K miles, did they rest at all? No, that's 11 days of constant flapping. They will gain 50% of their body weight in fat reserves before they leave on a journey like this. Some of the hummingbirds will gain almost double their body weight before they start their migration process. It takes a lot of energy to keep those little hummers in the air. Is there a good place in the metro area to see bluebirds? Yes. Almost any of the open spaces. Chatfield Reservoir's got a good bunch of them. If you can make it down here into Douglas County, most of our open spaces have bluebird trails. They're very common. There's also a good bluebird trail system over on Cherry Creek Reservoir in that area. So yes, they're all around. Up north into Boulder, there's a number of other bluebird routes up there. Is the Monte Vista area compatible or comparable to Nebraska? No. You're going to see a few thousand birds at Monte Vista, which, because of its small scale, is pretty spectacular. I love it. We were there not this year, but the year before, just before the Crane Festival. The Crane Festival is really cool from everybody I've talked to. I would encourage anyone to go down and visit with them. They have good lectures. They have good people going out and guiding. But just to see the birds, you can go down a week before, a week after, still see lots of birds, thousands of birds, and it's really cool. Another really great place that's about the same distance to travel as Nebraska is to go down to the Bosque del Apache in Socorro County in south central New Mexico. And that's more of a wintering ground. It's not a migration area. So you'll go down and see them in one of my favorite times is the week between Christmas and New Year's. Nobody goes down there during that time period. It's a wonderful place just to go visit. I also went to school in Socorro and went to college there and did my undergraduate work. Yes, great blue herons are starting to come back into Castle Rock. There are a couple heronries in Douglas County. There's one south of Castle Rock. There's one over near Parker, and there's one in Parker right at Parker Road and 470. It's just north of that intersection on Cherry Creek, on the Cherry Creek Trail. Great things to go look at. They're absolutely beautiful. And yes, they do. The great blue herons do seem to go back to the same heronries each year. I'm not quite sure how that works with the youngsters. I don't know if the youngsters go pick and choose. I don't know if they wait for an empty nest and claim it, but it does seem to be the same herons that come back into the heronries each year. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. By the
Okay.
way, it's almost 8. If anybody wants to, log off, thank you so much, Kurt. But if you want to stick around, would you mind answering another question or two?
I can do that.
Okay. Could you tell us anything about the little backpacks and who is creating those and how I mean, I get how it's tracking and they fly past something and it gathers the data, but tell me like the concept of that and the testing of that and determining that, it doesn't interfere with their flight patterns, their health, their mating, anything. I'm fascinated.
They're sized to the particular type of bird to where it doesn't interfere with their flight. It doesn't interfere with their mating and their daily life. They can still feed, they can still function as a bird. Okay. Arguably, even a half an ounce on a small bird is a lot. Okay. So the backpacks for small birds are really, really low power, really small, and consequently we can't get a lot of data from them. It requires flying by something, and then it becomes like an RF QR code. So you see some of the in Best Buy or something like that, they'll have a tag on it that sets off an alarm when you walk through the door if you haven't paid for it, and they remove the tag. And it's that level of technology. It's super simple, super low power, but it has to be very close to the receptor to make that happen. They did a lot of experimentation on it. There's some great papers out there. A great place to go look is to look at the MOTUS website, MOTUS.
Okay.
Right? And that's going to give you a lot of background on this kind of technology.
Okay, thank you. Have they been around for a while?
They have.
Okay.
At least probably 5-6 years. And well, longer than that, because the Rough-Legged Hawk project, I think, goes back into the mid 1990s.
Okay.
Mid 2010s. Excuse me. I'm getting confused here. All right.
You have one more question. I lovingly make sugar water, put it in my Hummer feeder. It always gets ignored. At the same time, I see them in my penstemons and sage. What am I doing wrong?
Excellent question. It depends on where it is, what other birds are going to be around that hummingbird, that hummingbird feeder. Is it within eyesight of the other plants where they do frequent? Move it closer to it. We have ours up on our back deck, and right below the back deck we have a wildflower garden. So the birds come in and naturally approach the wildflowers, and then every now and then they'll come up and get after our feeders. You can try changing to a different color of feeder. I've heard sometimes that helps. If it's red, go to yellow. If it's yellow, go to red. Those kinds of things. You might put white flower, stickers on it. Those are things that have been, that people have done. It's going to take them often a couple of weeks to find it. So sometimes patience is the answer. I don't know what else I can suggest on that one. Okay.
All right. It looks like that's it.
All right. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. I hope you enjoyed it.
It was great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.